Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. My name is Mike Frank. I'm the director here of Hoover's Washington, D.C. office, and we're real excited about this. I just want to say in advance, I've read the book. It's really good. I encourage you to not just put it on your shelf, right? You got to read it. And to come back, we'll do a quiz, okay?
Buy it for your friends and daughters and sons.
But really, it's well written. Not surprisingly, James is a great writer. Just glad to have him here tonight. Tod Lindberg, who is the designated Renaissance man of Hoover's Washington, D.C. office, is our interviewer tonight, and he's prepared, and he's going to be better than Charlie Rose. He's going to be better than anyone you've seen. Maybe not William F. Buckley, but he'll be very close. So, Tod, take it over. James, thanks for being here and doing this with us.
Thank you, Mike, for lowering expectations so successfully. Maybe there's a kind of double reverse. There's a more florid introduction. I don't know. Anyway, great to have you here. Welcome. I'm Tod Lindberg. I'm a fellow at the research fellow here at the Hoover Institution based in our Washington, D.C. office. And for those of you who are returning, good to have you back. And for those of you who are first-timers, welcome. Tonight we have James Kirchick to talk about his new book, The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age. And Jamie is a fellow at the Foreign Policy Initiative, and also a correspondent for the Daily Beast, a prolific writer and a very good writer. And he's written a very interesting and important book. And I'm going to just read you a little bit of it to give you a little flavor of it and also kind of to set the scene. Jamie writes, as you read this, Europe is undergoing convulsions greater than anything it has experienced in decades. Just 5 years after winning the Nobel Peace Prize, the European Union, one of the most ambitious political projects in history, is crumbling. Threatening its very existence is the convergence of several crises, almost 10 years of zero economic growth, a resurgent Russia, rising Islamic extremism, and the greatest mass movement of humanity since the late 1940s. What once appeared irreversible, ever greater political and economic integration on a continent where armed conflict had been banished to the dustbin of history, along with totalitarian ideologies like communism and fascism, today seems a transient historical phase. Border controls have been reestablished where they had been absent for decades. A sequence of violently transformative events ranging from Russia's invasion of Ukraine to spectacular Islamist terrorist attacks, along with more transformative phenomena such as Britain's exit from the EU and the rise of illiberal democracy in places like Hungary and Poland, has put the continent's future stability in serious doubt. Thriving on disorder and uncertainty, populist political parties across the continent make steady electoral gains, a signal of growing exhaustion with the technocratic incrementalism of liberal democracy. Nationalist, anti-American, often racist and anti-Semitic, these forces evoke Europe's foulest traditions. So I give you a little flavor not only of what Jamie's talking about in this book, but also of his prose style, which is fluid, engaging, and compelling. So Jamie, thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Let's talk a little bit about what ails Europe. And I guess the book is more or less divided geographically. It's with sections on Russia, on Ukraine, on Brexit, on France, on Germany, Hungary, etc. But all those topics aren't really self-contained. They spill back and forth into each other. And so in effect, your chapters, although they're organized geographically, have a kind of thematic quality to them that I think is extremely effective. So I want to start not so much with the geography, but with a more basic question, which is what ails Europe?
I think it's a crisis of values. I think there's a lot of talk about institutions and how much power should we give the European Commission versus the Parliament, or should the Eurozone be extended to other countries or whatnot. But I think it fundamentally comes down to values. And I think there were three assumptions in 1989 that we believed in, and we thought that they were irreversible, and they seem to be challenged now. One is democracy, and we thought that democracy was settled. This was obviously the whole Fukuyama thesis. And now it's being challenged overtly in a place like Hungary, where the prime minister openly talks about illiberal democracy and turning his country into an illiberal state, and he holds up Turkey, Russia, and China as being models for his country. On the economic front, we had assumed that regulated market capitalism would be the future, and while I still believe in that myself, it's obviously, at least in the Eurozone, it has not been performing as well as we would have hoped, with 0 or 1% growth really over the past 10 years. And then finally, on the security front, we had all assumed that once the Cold War was over, that Russia would no longer be a threat, that it would be integrated into these institutions. And now that's obviously been repudiated with Ukraine, the first forced violent annexation of territory on the European continent since World War II, and a war that still goes on and has claimed the lives of 10,000 people. But even before that, we could even go as far back as to Georgia in the Georgian War of 2008, which I think in retrospect, the lack of a firm Western response to what happened in Georgia, I think, really laid the groundwork for the years of Russian aggression that just kept on building and culminated in 2014. And Russia more broadly just clearly is a revisionist power that does not accept the post-Cold War settlement. Even though they signed all these agreements, even though the Soviet Union was dissolved in Russia by the Russian Soviet at that time, it is clear at this point that the Russian regime does not like the terms that were agreed upon in the series of agreements that they signed, and that they are trying to overturn those agreements.
So we got a political crisis combined with an economic crisis combined with a security crisis.
Yes.
Of the three, which is the most serious?
I would have to say the Russian crisis, which is more than just a security crisis, because I think Russia presents, as it did during the Cold War, and anyone who is affiliated with Hoover should go visit the Hoover archives and take a look at the vast collection they have there. I think we are engaged again in an intellectual, ideological struggle. This time, it's a harder one to fight, I think, because during the Cold War it was pretty easy. You knew who the enemy was. It was the Soviet Union, and it was communism. It was Marxist-Leninism. And we knew that there were communist parties in the West and fellow travelers, and it was you were on one side or the other, basically. And now it's a much more diffuse threat. The Russian regime is willing to support everyone from Nigel Farage and the Brexit campaign and the far right in France to the far left in Germany and the Syriza party in Greece. And so all these problems that we have in Europe, they're obviously all indigenous. Anyone who is familiar with European history knows that Europeans don't need outside instigators to support horrible ideologies and populism and fascism and communism. They can do that well on their own. But if you look at them, it seems to me that they're all exacerbated by Russian influence, whether overtly through bank loans to the National Front in France, or through other more subtle means, the disinformation campaigns, the way in which the migrant crisis has been exploited by Russia. And you see in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, it's this strange sort of confluence where countries and political movements that you would suspect would be the most resistant to the Kremlin, sort of conservative movements. Viktor Orban is a perfect example of this, someone who was an anti-communist freedom fighter in the late 1980s. His country was, obviously Hungary, as we all know, was invaded and occupied brutally by the Soviets. The narratives that the Russians are putting out about the decline of Western civilization, of Judeo-Christian civilization against this Islamic threat, these narratives are being echoed and promoted by Central and Eastern European conservative movements. So it's worrying to see in places where we would have thought that the knowledge and the memory and the history of what Russia did as a great power, it has not inoculated them from basically allying themselves, maybe even unwittingly allying themselves with these Russian narratives.
What does Putin want?
I think he wants, as I said earlier, I think he wants to overthrow the liberal international order. And this is kind of a vague term, but I think it largely refers to the set of arrangements, the rules, the institutions, the norms, and the values that have basically guided or that have basically run the world since the end of World War II. And they were established by the United States and its allies through the Marshall Plan, and they take shape in the form of NATO, in the United Nations, in Asia with our alliance structure with Japan and South Korea, international law, the UN Charter, the Paris Charter that was signed after the Cold War ended, even the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, which made it clear that borders in Europe would not be changed by force anymore. They want to replace this system of rules and values with a world where might makes right, and where basically large countries that are powerful can have their way with smaller ones. And when I say the end of Europe, I'm not necessarily referring to the end of the EU. I'm not referring to necessarily a catastrophic war like World War II again. I think it's much more possible, and what I'm referring to, and that's basically the coming to power of governments, of movements that lack these values, that don't believe in these values, that are purely transactional, and that are willing to make deals with the Russians on a bilateral basis. I think the great achievement of the European Union has been it's enabled Europe to act for the first time really as a geopolitical power, as a geopolitical liberal power, in the same way that the United States is a liberal world power. And I think that the Russians are trying to drive wedges, sow divisions, to break up this alliance so that they can do what they've always done, which is divide and rule. And they can deal with German energy companies, Italian energy companies, French far right, the Greek far left. That is their vision of Europe.
Do you think Europeans have more a Putin problem than a Russia problem, or is it more a Russia problem than a Putin problem?
I think it's more of a Russia problem. I obviously think Putin is clearly the embodiment of this, of the regime right now, but it extends far beyond him. And these problems are not going to go away were he to leave power. I think there are far too many people who are implicated in this. And I also think he is genuinely popular. And I think the new sort of Eurasianist ideology of kind of Russian nationalism, strongman rule, it's kind of a blend of Tsarism and Soviet communism in a strange way. I think this is actually supported by a lot of people in Russia. And you obviously can't trust the polls that you see about how popular Putin is, despite what our president says. I don't think in a country like Russia you can trust polls when someone calls you on your home phone in Moscow and asks you, do you like the president? I'm not sure that those poll numbers should be trusted. That said, I do think he is a legitimately popular leader. And unfortunately, I think Russia is a country where a vast segment of the population, they take pride in things that a normal democratic country does not take pride in. So in America, we take pride in our Constitution. We take pride in, or in Germany, they take pride in, say, their amazing industries and their export production. Russia, I'm afraid to say, takes pride, or they derive a lot of pride from how much they can humiliate their neighbors. And it pains me to say this, but it's hard for me to watch Russia and to watch the media and to listen to Russian politicians, and even ones who are not rabid Putinists. It's hard not to escape this conclusion that there is a great deal of resentment at how the Cold War ended and how Russia is viewed in the world. And I think that this is a problem that we're going to be dealing with for a very long time.
Let's shift gears, but only a little bit, because you referred to Putin's popularity, and obviously there are reasons to doubt the top lines of the opinion polling on the subject. But you also concede that he is popular. And that is not unique to Russia in the sense of an increasingly authoritarian ruler who is nevertheless a public darling, or at least something of one, even as that ruler closes down avenues for the opposition, press, assembly, all kinds of things, knock on the door in the middle of the night kind of stuff at times. And that too has shown up a little bit in Europe, no?
Yes, I think there seems to be this craving for the strongman, and not even for the strongman, but also for the demagogue, which is the subtitle of the book. And I think we can look at a country like the Netherlands today, which is going through an election, and you see a figure like Geert Wilders, who is the quintessential demagogue. This is a man who exploits legitimate frustrations. I think that there are real problems with Islamic immigration into Europe and assimilation. And unfortunately, there's been a lack of clarity or honesty among mainstream politicians in many countries. You can look at Sweden, which there was a huge scandal about this a couple of weeks ago because of what the president said. And he actually had a point. I mean, there are problems related to Islamic immigration in Sweden. And I think there's been a failure of European political elites to address these concerns in an honest and open way and to basically create a taboo around this topic. Hoping that it would go away and that people would basically forget about it and vote on other topics. And I think the opposite happened. I think when the responsible mainstream ignores a social phenomenon that people are concerned about, it doesn't go away. It means that the people will gravitate towards the most unscrupulous demagogic characters who talk about it. And so if you look at a country like Sweden, where there was this sort of consensus on the left and the right that we're not going to talk about immigration, the second most popular party in Sweden today is a party called the Sweden Democrats, and they have their origins in the neo-Nazi movement in Sweden, and the neo-fascist neo-Nazi movement. And I think that that is a direct result of a failure to talk about these subjects. Yeah. I don't know
I think that's very interesting. But is it just a matter of talk? Has Europe had the right immigration policies for the past couple decades?
I would say no.
All right.
I think if you look back at the history of immigration in Europe, there was a post-war boom where basically the continent needed to be rebuilt, and there were lots of jobs available. And countries like Germany and the Netherlands and others took in lots of Turks, or in the case of France, it was a colonial legacy, people coming from Morocco. And there was the assumption that these people would leave after the job was done. And they didn't, and they brought their families. And I don't think Europe was prepared for this, and I don't think they're equipped to deal with it. I think in America, we're really blessed by our history as an immigrant society. And having lived in Europe and traveled through many countries, I can honestly say that we do probably the best job, maybe next to Canada, in assimilating and integrating people from all over the world. But we're very unique in that because of what our country is. And I think a lot of these European countries, they remain unable to separate sort of the blood and soil connection to citizenship with a more civic nationalism, or what Jürgen Habermas refers to as a constitutional patriotism in Germany. And that this has been a real impediment to assimilating immigrants. At the other end of this, a lot of these immigrants who come don't seem to want to assimilate. You can't just blame European governments and policies for these problems. I think that I think Muslim immigrants coming from North Africa and from the Middle East, there are bigger challenges in assimilating those populations than there are Mexicans coming to California. I just think that's a truth. And it's difficult to talk about these questions. It's less difficult to talk about them here in the United States. It's more difficult to talk about them in Europe because of the colonial legacy, or because of, obviously, the wartime legacy. People are very sensitive about this.
In case you're wondering a little bit about Jamie's response to some of these issues at a kind of, I would almost say, a visceral level. It's not merely a visceral level. It's a well-considered visceral level. But Jamie says, the more properly liberal reaction to seeing a woman covered head to toe in a burqa, particularly on a sweltering hot French beach, is not smug self-satisfaction with multicultural diversity, but unease, if not revulsion. Those put off by the importation into Europe of desert Arabian mores and practices cannot all be written off as racists. should democratic governments such as France choose to prohibit the wearing of such religious garb in public institutions. It is not necessarily Islamophobic of them to do so.
I do think that. I mean, that's my personal reaction when I see a woman covered head to toe in that. It's not. It gives me chills, and it's not something that I think. I don't want to see more of it. I don't want it in my neighborhood, and I can't imagine most people in Europe want it in their neighborhoods. Yet, now I'll distinguish my response to what Geert Wilders said and what he got in trouble for. He said, "Do we want more Moroccans or less Moroccans in this country?" To a crowd of people, and they all shouted less. And then he referred to Moroccans. He said they're scum. They're not all scum, but they're scum. I think there's a difference between these two responses. And I think the problem is that they're too often conflated. And I think we're seeing now, finally, we're seeing leaders like Merkel and Mark Rutte, who's the center-right prime minister. They're trying to reclaim this ground from the demagogues. And so Merkel, a couple months ago, when she was renominated for the chancellorship, she came out in favor of a burqa ban. And cynics might say she did this because she's trying to shore up her right-wing flank, because of her position on the migrant crisis. She may be doing that, and that may be a wise political move. I actually happen to agree with it as a political matter. And Mark Rutte, his party, they published a full-page ad in a newspaper saying, if you don't like it here and you're not willing to accept Dutch values, go home. And I think that is. There are a lot of writers more liberal than me who would call this demagogic. I don't think it is. I think it is, you might not like it, you might not agree with it, but I don't think it's beyond the realm of, acceptable statesmanship.
Yeah, and so usually I think that there is a tendency to say, well, even if we in general agree with the principles of, say, laïcité in France, that maybe that the ban on the headscarf goes too far. Where do you draw this line?
I would agree. I think the headscarf ban is too far, because for me that is religious expression, and that's something that there are Orthodox Jewish women who wear wigs, and I don't have a problem with that. The face veil is actually, I don't think there's anything in the Quran that says this. This is a particular interpretation of Islam that is adopted in certain, as I said, desert Arabian cultures. Indonesia, which is the biggest Muslim democracy in the world, you're not going to see many face veils there. So I make a distinction between something like the headscarf and the face veil. And I think that in France, on this particular aspect, I actually do think that is too far, or prohibiting people from wearing a cross around their neck. I find that to be a bit too extreme. For me, it's less a question of religion in this case with the face veil. This is misogyny. I mean, let's be honest about what this is. I see it as marking a woman as territory, as property, and saying, this is my wife, she's my property. And I find that unacceptable in a liberal society.
Well, there was a very interesting story in New York about a young Muslim woman who said she'd been attacked on a
Yes.
train by a couple of conspicuous Trump supporters, right, or something like that. And it turned out subsequently that this was a largely fabricated story, an entirely fabricated story, that she was really most concerned about.
She was dating a Christian, and her father, she was coming home late. She broke curfew. And the next time, I believe she was photographed in public, she had her head shaved by her father. Yes.
As reprisal for being out late and such. So
Yes.
there is a certain element of doubt that comes into the question when you say something like, well, what about people who simply want to wear that?
Yes, you often hear this expression that this is a woman's choice to do this, to which I'm just aghast at that. I mean, for one, I'm sure most of the women are actually forced to do this by their husbands. And two, if they're not, then they are at least raised in a society where they feel that this is necessary and they feel that they are pressured to do this. In which case, I say, why would you want this in your country? Why would you want to bring these people into your country?
And it's this question that has not been addressed by.
I think it's rarely addressed. I think the failure of the main center-right parties, the main center-left parties, the failure to talk as I am, I think, opens the field and creates a vacuum for the alternative for Deutschland, which is a far-right nationalist party, or Geert Wilders, or a whole array of other really unscrupulous people.
Let's talk a little bit about the economic difficulties as well. We've got you talked about the slow growth problem, and then we've had the more conspicuous problems, for example, that of Greece. What was the Greece problem, and has it been adequately addressed?
I come down more on the side of the creditors, I guess, on this question. I don't think that the euro was ill-fated from the start to be this disastrous monetary union. And I see Warren Coates, who's an expert, and he can maybe correct me on this in the question and answer period. But I think a lot of the economic problems that Europe faces are the fault of national governments making bad economic policy. And I think Greece is a perfect example of this. This is a country that has a clientelist political economic system where people joined political parties to get government jobs, where massive regulations, just to open up a pharmacy would cost you tens of thousands of dollars to get the right permits and whatnot. Very low private sector growth, corruption, just sort of sclerotic, almost third world style political and economic arrangements. And I think if you look at a country like the Baltic states, you look at Latvia, which went through a similar economic crisis as the Greeks did. They weren't on the euro, but they had pegged their currency to the euro, so it was, for all intents and purposes, the same. They went through belt tightening, they cut their budgets, they went through austerity, and they came out successful. And I don't know why Greece can't adopt those sorts of policies. I think this is a political problem in Greece. And there's a Czech journalist I quote in there he makes this argument to a Greek colleague. And the Greek says, well, you guys are post-communists. You're expected to be poor and to have lower living standards. We can't have that in Greece. And I think that really says it all. So, is there blame to go around in Greece? Absolutely. Were there loans that were made by German banks that should not have been made? Sure. Equally, those loans probably shouldn't have been taken by Greeks. So I don't know if I would call myself a euro optimist or pessimist, but I believe in the euro. I think it makes economic sense to have some, in order to economically integrate these economies. I do believe in it. I think it was more than just a political project. It was more than just a project to, bring the countries together economically, and so therefore they wouldn't go to war. That was obviously an inspiration, but I do think it makes economic sense. The degree to which there needs to be, more euro bonds or more fiscal. If the Germans are going to bail out the Greeks more, that's a separate question. But at the end of the day, I do believe in the economic sense of the euro, and I think the lack of growth in the eurozone is not because of the euro. I think it's again because of poor economic decisions made by individual European governments.
How do you break that cycle?
Well, I guess you hope things get so bad that people wake up and realize what needs to be done. And I mean, there are some European governments, like I said before, the Balts have shown good economic performance. Poland, which was, I think, the only country in the Eurozone not to experience negative growth, they actually maintained growth throughout this crisis. So there are models that can be followed. Whether things have to get so bad before they get good again, that may be the case. But like in France, I think we all know what needs to be done in France. It just never happens, regardless of whether it's the socialists in power or whether it's the center-right party in power. We know Sarkozy, he sort of tried to make some minor adjustments to the French welfare state, and there were massive protests. And it might just be that the political pressures are so great that they are not able to reform these systems. But again, I think it's ultimately a political problem rather than it is a problem to be blame Brussels for.
When you talk about it in the terms that you've been discussing it, it sounds like it might be as much a cultural problem as a political problem. If we're all sort of rational human beings, accumulating information as we go along and making adjustments in our policies accordingly, then there's no reason not to learn from your mistakes and to make these kinds of adjustments.
Absolutely.
And yet, we have examples of countries that do appear to be following that kind of model.
It's also here too. I mean, how many more lessons do we need in economic history to know that protectionism is a bad idea, doesn't work, and leads to horrible outcomes? I mean, any AP economics student could tell you this. But in this country, we seem to have forgotten that now. We seem to be supporting economic nationalism again. So I think one of the lessons, or one of the arguments I make in this book, is that we seem to be ignorant of history on all fronts, on economic, on political, and when it comes to dealing with Russia, we seem to not be cognizant of the historical lessons that might be obvious to people like you and me, but are clearly not obvious to a lot of other people.
I want to shift one more time because there's a fascinating chapter on France, which is not related to the French economic difficulties especially, but is actually related, it takes as its main subject, the out-migration of Jews from France to Israel. What's the number these days?
Well, I think the last year that numbers were recorded it was at 8,000.
Uh-huh.
That was one of the highest.
And how does that
levels.
compare to historical levels?
Oh, it's much higher. I think the year prior to that was only about 2,000. So it basically quadrupled in 1 year.
So
And
what's
the number,
going on?
well, so there was this after the Charlie Hebdo attack, where there was also an attack on a kosher supermarket. The Prime Minister of France, Manuel Valls, gave this very moving speech where he said he's of Spanish descent. He was born to Spanish parents, and he said if 100,000 Spaniards, left France tomorrow, France would still be France. But if 100,000 Jews left France, France would not be France anymore. And I did the math, and I said, well, if the numbers, if you have 8,000 Jews leaving every year, then it's not that long before France isn't France anymore. And this is one of the consequences, I think, of Muslim immigration. I mean, the vast majority of the anti-Semitic attacks, certainly all the deadly ones, have been committed by Islamists. And it's a depressing story. Obviously, it's hard to be optimistic about this question about the future of Jews in Europe. But I would say if there is some silver lining in this, I think it is that the problem of Islamism in Europe. It's much different, obviously, than the previous incarnation of anti-Semitism in Europe, which was state-sponsored by governments. And you now have, I think it's notable that in Paris, in these attacks, but also in several months later in Copenhagen, you had an attack on a symbol of free speech. In Paris, it was a newspaper. In Copenhagen, it was a panel discussion on freedom of speech issues, followed by an attack on a Jewish institution. And so I think it is becoming clearer to Europeans that these are not just attacks on Jews, these are attacks on the liberal society, on the basic freedoms that Europeans hold dear. And so I think I would like to think that, and certainly the response of European governments has been resolute. Mm-hmm. This is not something that they are ignoring. Mm-hmm. If you look at France, it's depressing, but every Jewish institution basically has an armed soldier or several outside of it. So this is clearly something that they're investing resources into combating. But it's not a very optimistic.
I was in Brussels a couple of years ago, and I walked by the old synagogue, and there was indeed a very large contingent of soldiers, half a dozen or so, guarding the place. And I went to take a picture, and they came over and asked me not to do that. And that was out of concern, they said, for their own security.
Well, I would say just about going back to Geert Wilders. I mean, obviously, as I said before, he's a demagogue, he's a racist, he's said awful things. No one seems to remark about how this man has to live under 24/7 protection. As much as I despise this guy, I don't think that his life should be in danger. And obviously, there's a history of this in the Netherlands, going back to Pim Fortuyn, who was a similar sort of outlandish, very strong critic of Islam, who was assassinated in 2002. You then had Theo van Gogh, who was stabbed in broad daylight with a note pinned to his chest with basically a list of individuals who were next to be targeted, including Wilders and Ayaan Hirsi Ali. So it seems in our outrage about Geert Wilders and sort of the elite media political outrage about how much of a hate monger Geert Wilders is, it's not the people that he's criticizing who have to have 24-hour police protection. It's him. And I was in Copenhagen a couple months ago, and I was at a meeting of a small free speech society with a man named Lars Vilks, who was a Swedish cartoonist who was one of the contributors to that famous newspaper, the Danish newspaper that started the Mohammed cartoons. There were 12 cartoons, I believe, and he drew one of them. And this is a man who, again, he lives under 24/7 police protection. Just to meet with him, to join a dinner, it was like meeting with, Václav Havel in 1983 in Czechoslovakia. We had to go to an undisclosed location. It was a private apartment, and there were two very strong, buff security guards, plainclothes policemen, standing watch 24/7 at the door. The following night, I had coffee with a friend of mine named Fleming Rose, who was the editor of that newspaper that published those cartoons. Sitting inconspicuously in the cafe was another armed police officer. What does it say about our societies, about our democratic societies, that people who engage in free speech have to live under police protection? I think that is atrocious. And I think that is not given enough attention.
What about, I want to come back to Putin, because you also had, since we're reminiscing a little bit here, you had an interesting experience on Russian television.
I did.
And maybe you'll tell that story.
Yeah, I was once invited on RT, which is this network that we're unfortunately much more familiar with now. But it's the English language, basically disinformation propaganda network. And they had invited me on to talk about the sentencing of Chelsea Manning. And I had other ideas, and I started protesting the Putin regime quite loudly and was kicked off after about 2 minutes. And then the Russians canceled my car to the airport, which was very rude of them, I thought. I was in Sweden, and I was in the midst of a vacation, and I was flying to Estonia, and they canceled the car on the way to the airport. But a couple of years ago, I saw RT as being this sort of silly, conspiratorial network that not many people watched. And it's just been amazing over the past 4 years, the extent to which the Russian disinformation operation has become much more skilled, much more insidious in the way it's been able to insinuate itself into the kind of Western conversation. And obviously, you can go read the unclassified intelligence report that the intelligence community published here about the Russian influence campaign in our own election. And I was shocked, having worked at RFERL, Radio Free Europe, and covering the kind of periphery of the Soviet Union in these places. I was shocked to see these tactics that the Russians used in places like Kyrgyzstan or Serbia, to see these tactics used in the United States, and to see that our society was not as resilient to them as I would have hoped they were. I think we have a lot to learn from countries like the Baltics, where the general population is they're very attuned to how Russian disinformation and Russian narratives work. They're very, they know the game, they know the narratives, they know the stories. And I feel like in this country, whether it was the left, the Bernie supporters who didn't seem to care that the DNC leak in the information that showed favoritism for Hillary, they didn't seem to see that this was part of a Russian influence campaign directed at them to make them hate Hillary Clinton and to oppose her so that she would be weakened. And similarly, many people on the right did not understand the way in which the WikiLeaks was being used in a similar fashion to boost Donald Trump's fortunes. These are called active measures. It's a Cold War term. It's not new. And I think we need people like Ross Wilson here to educate us on how Russian disinformation works, because I don't think that as a culture, as a society, I think we've sort of forgotten we've forgotten how to deal with it.
You quote the historian Timothy Snyder, who's got a very good term for this.
Applied postmodernism.
Applied postmodernism. It's the doctrine that since nothing really actually signifies anything except its own rhetorical verbal structure that you can use whatever rhetorical verbal structure you want in constructing whatever kind of narrative you
Right.
would be to your advantage.
The Russian propaganda of old, it was very clear. It was, we are venerating the Soviet system, Marxist, Leninism, communism, and the capitalists are blood-sucking pigs and whatnot. It was very obvious. You could tell. And obviously, there were more subtle forms of it, certainly, but it was clear. It was much more clear. Today, you watch RT or you read Sputnik or you listen to the Russian disinformation outlets, and there's very little talk about Russia. They're not venerating or extolling Vladimir Putin necessarily or the Russian system. It's a much more cynical message, which is basically that everything is corrupt. You're all corrupt. Democracy is corrupt. It's a sham. Neoliberalism is a word you hear a lot now. Globalism. This is a term that I thought only the John Birch Society used. Now it's all over the place. And they're sowing cynicism and doubt in Western societies in order that, as my friend Peter Pomerantsev has written a great book about Russia called it, nothing is true and everything is possible. If there's one phrase that can sort of encapsulate what the Russian narrative is, I would say it's that.
Is the title of your book, the main title that is, The End of Europe, is that 2 words too long, maybe?
Well, some people were saying that I should do a sequel or retitle it The End of America, but I'm not. I think it's too soon for that. I'm not gonna entertain that. But
And yet you can't, you couldn't help introducing a hopeful note into your concluding chapter.
yes, there are absolutely reasons for hope, and I think a lot of the so the final chapter is Ukraine, and I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time there over the past couple of years, and Ukraine is the first place that anyone has died under the EU flag, and when you read about the EU, you can read, you'll often read about how they're regulating the size of pickles, and it's this massive bureaucratic monstrosity. But then you go to a place like Ukraine, and you see people who are dying because they want to be a part of this idea, this European idea, and it means that much to them. And again, I think I'm informed by the experience I had working for Radio Free Europe. I lived in the Czech Republic. I spent a lot of time in places like Poland and Ukraine and the Baltic states. And that really moved me as a writer and as a person, that I think I fundamentally understand what Europe means to these people. It's not just an institution with rules and about trade and about it's about values fundamentally. And if we're going to be reminded of that, I think it's going to come from some of the newer members of the EU.
That's great. We've got time for some questions if anyone would care to ask one. And if we're going to have some microphones around us so we can catch it for the audio. We're streaming this and it'll be available online as well. So yes.
In your presentation in the book, you've covered the political, the economic, and the military issues that Europe is facing. You haven't addressed as much, maybe it is in the book, of the social or particularly the demographics. I look at France and their population in 8 years, by 2025, less than half of the children under the age of 18 are French. The rest are the majorities. And where does that take them 20 years out? France being a nuclear power, et cetera. Europe is losing the baby production. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, I don't know how you reverse that. And I think that is a function, that is emblematic of, I think, of what a society believes about itself and its future. If a society isn't reproducing, it has to mean that they're very pessimistic. That's how I see it. If you're not having children, then you probably aren't, as on an aggregate level, if a society is not producing future generations, then it can't be that optimistic about its future. So introducing natalist policies, I don't know if that's going to do anything. Some people have tied this to the decline of religion, of the sort of decline of Christianity. Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know how you reverse that. I'm not sure it can be. Not sure it can be solved. I'm not sure. I think Europeans have to have more self-confidence about their societies, and then they'll probably start having more children.
My name is Alex. I'm a Fulbright student here from Russia. Actually, first 15 minutes made my blood boil, and I am not a Putin supporter. I volunteered for a major opposition leader in his political campaign when he ran for Russian mayor. But the things you said about my country are really outrageous. And it's when I was coming here, I was expecting to hear talk about the end of Europe, and I was thinking about the issues that face the European Union, and the first chapter, and your scapegoat. I guess I looked throughout the book, and it is used as a scapegoat. Is Russia? Any kind of trend that's taking place in Europe, especially the rise of authoritarianism, is also sort of redirected to Russia, that Russia is the root of all evil. I have a question, which I really I'll have to mince words because I was very emotionally charged in the very beginning of your talk. Do you think, and I'm rephrasing, I will be rephrasing some American opinion leaders and thought leaders, do you think that Americans are humiliating themselves and making fun of themselves, blaming other nations and other countries and other social systems for their own problems? Because if you look out of the window right there, this globalist, this pro-integration sentiment has already been defeated electorally. And I mean, elections should have consequences. There should be an intellectual revision of these things that have not necessarily been working out. If people turn out to vote in such huge numbers against these people, against these elites, against this agenda. Okay, so do you think you're making a good service for your causes, or you're really making fun of them? Thank you.
I think that's somewhat of a mischaracterization of what I said. I was very clear in remarking that Europeans don't require, I'll quote myself again, they don't require any sort of outside instigation or meddling to support, in my opinion, illiberal movements, whether on the far right or the far left. The National Front in France would exist regardless of whether or not Russia was a country, whether or not Russia was sending them money. There's a long history of this sort of political thought in France, going at least as far back to Vichy. And that's how this party got its start, was Algerian war veterans. Same goes for the far left in Greece. They don't need Russian money or support to exist. That goes back to the Greek Civil War. What I did say is that Russia is exacerbating these problems and is trying to sow disintegration and division. And that's just a fact. As to the second part of your question, I mean, this book is not a book about America. It's a book about Europe. So I can't really, get into the. I mean, I don't discuss really what you said. I can just give my personal opinion. I mean, Donald Trump lost the popular vote, so I'm not really sure the extent to which you can claim that the ideas of globalism, whatever that means, were rejected by the American people. But more importantly, just because a lot of people believe something doesn't mean it's true or it's right. And I'm not going to tell you that I think immigration is bad for this country or free trade is bad for this country just because 46 million Americans seem to disagree with me.
Later this year, the scuttlebutt is that one of the big fights is between Conor McGregor, the great Conor McGregor, and Floyd Mayweather, who outlasts whom. Another battle on that order is Chancellor Merkel's re-election, and whether or not she holds serve or bests Mr. Putin. Comment on that. And the other thing is it necessarily a sense that he wants to roll back LIEO or just wants to check it? Thanks.
Roll back what?
The liberal international
yes.
economic.
I thought you were going to say Merkel versus Schultz, who's the new chancellor candidate. But I agree with you. I do think this is.
I want to talk about Conor McGregor. That's
not my field. I actually, the chapter on Germany is about the NSA scandal, and I use that as a prism to explore Germany and Germans' perception of their country and where it stands as a geopolitical power. Does it belong in the West, or does it belong as sort of a middle power? And this is a question that has sort of haunted German foreign policy thinking since the end of World War II, when you had Adenauer, who was very much a supporter of keeping Germany divided, but West Germany in the West, and you had the Social Democrats, many of them who wanted a united Germany that was a neutral country. And I think that you have to understand that history to understand the NSA scandal, because I think a lot of the NSA scandal was motivated by anti-Americanism and anti-Westernism. Yes, a belief that Germany should not be, that Germany was being victimized by the United States and that they had been victimized for decades and that they were tired of this. And so I trace and I see Snowden as being part of a Russian disinformation campaign, largely directed at Germany. I don't think it's coincidental that the first parliamentarian of any country in the world to visit Edward Snowden was a far-left member of the German Green Party who had been a lawyer for the Red Army faction in the 1970s. A meeting like that does not happen without the FSB being involved. Chancellor Merkel's cell phone, this revelation coming out, that was intentional. The fact that there's still, 4 years onwards, there's still a parliamentary investigation into the NSA scandal, whereas in France, typical kind of French response, they got very angry about it for a week and then they went back to their normal lives because France engages in espionage as good or better than any other country in the world. And so I think Putin wants to displace Merkel. I think she is clearly holding the line on European unity, on sanctions against Russia. And her view of Russia is heavily informed by having grown up in East Germany and knowing what it's like to live in a police state. She speaks Russian fluently. She's dealt with Putin for years. And so I think he wants to get rid of her. And I think that for the past several years, there's been a concerted effort to destabilize Germany, to harm Chancellor Merkel's reputation among the German people, the way in which the Russians have weaponized the migrant crisis. If you look last year, there was a case where an ethnic Russian girl in Berlin went missing for a few hours, and it was claimed on Russian state television that she had been raped by a gang of migrants. This was completely concocted, false story, made up. That didn't stop the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, from raising it at a press conference and condemning the German government for covering up this rape of a poor young Russian girl. There are many examples of these sorts of fake news, we'll call them, being promulgated by Russian outlets, and they're all intended to harm Chancellor Merkel's reputation. And so I think, and now what's interesting is that we seem to have an administration here where I think there is one very senior advisor to the president who shares Vladimir Putin's detestation of Angela Merkel for different reasons, I think having to do with her views on refugees. I think this particular advisor, if you look at a media website that he used to run, has been running for years, has been campaigning against her. She's now in this very difficult position where in the East, she has to deal with an onslaught of disinformation, potential hacks and leaks. The Bundestag was hacked by the Russians in the summer of 2015. We don't know what they took, and we don't know what they're going to use. But we know that they hacked the Bundestag. So that's going to be coming in the next couple of months. And now in the West, she seems to have a president who she's meeting with on Friday, who I believe he attacked her on the campaign trail more than any other world leader. If you go back and look, I don't think there was any other world leader who was attacked more by President Trump than Angela Merkel.
Well, Barack Obama, probably.
Well, yes, but foreign leader. I think it was probably her, which I find, as much as I disagreed with her on her migrant policy, I admire her immensely. I think she's been a good chancellor. I think she's been a good leader for Europe. I think in dealing with the security threats that the Russians pose, she has really held a disparate group of 28 countries, each with their own competing economic agendas. Many of them don't want to sign on to these sanctions, and it only takes one country vetoing them at the EU every 6 months to break them apart, and she's been able to hold this coalition together. So absolutely, Vladimir Putin wants to unseat her, and I think we're going to see a slew of disinformation thrown her way over the next couple of months.
James, the recent discussions about the amount of resources the EU countries devote to national security, General Mattis's or Secretary Mattis's concerns about that, among others. Where is that going to go? The trade-offs obviously seem to be between the welfare
Yeah.
states in those countries and their national security investments. Predictions and consequences.
Well, I guess if there's a silver lining to Donald Trump's constant harping on the NATO 2% is that he may have scared the Europeans enough into increasing their defense spending. I don't like the way he went about doing it, but this is something that really every American president, I think, since Eisenhower has complained about. What distinguished Trump was obviously that he seemed to make America's support for NATO conditional upon whether or not these countries spend 2%. And that's sort of dangerous because the whole point of NATO is that it's supposed to be a deterrent. And when you start raising ambiguities and doubts about your reliance as an ally, then you send a bad message to Mr. Putin. But definitely you're seeing almost all the EU countries, the NATO members that are not spending the required 2%, they are moving in that direction. Germany is a real laggard here. I mean, Germany only spends about 1.3%. And what's incredible of the past couple of years is that you've seen Eastern European countries that have their own they have their own very difficult history with Germany. They now want German leadership. And a couple of years ago, the former Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski gave a speech in Berlin in which he said he feared a Germany that was less active than one that was more active. And so to hear that on German soil from a Polish politician was deeply moving and very meaningful. And when I talked to, Tom Ilves, the former president of Estonia, they, and that was obviously a country that was, invaded and occupied by the Germans many years ago. They want a more active Germany. So that's one question, is Germany going to spend more on their defense? But I think there's another element to this, which is, are they going to station more forces in the East? And that's a much more sensitive topic because there's still a large stream of thought in Europe that does not, that sees that as a provocation of the Russians. I don't share that view. Obviously, I think NATO is clearly a defensive alliance. I don't think anyone could seriously argue that NATO has any designs on invading Russia. But that fear still reigns in many European capitals.
Jamie, what do you see as the short-term and the long-term impact of Brexit?
I mean, I'm not very optimistic about it. You just saw a couple days ago, and this was very predictable, that the Scottish Nationalist Party once again called for an independence referendum. And that was very easy to see. I mean, Scotland is the most pro-European region of the United Kingdom. They voted 2-for-1 against Brexit. In fact, one of the main reasons why so many Scots voted against independence the last time in 2014 was because they didn't want to be outside the EU. And they feared that if they voted for independence and they became an independent country, they would have to apply for EU membership. And they didn't want to go through that. And they were told, stay in the UK, you stay in the EU. And now, 3 years later, they may be taken out of the EU against their will. And so I want the UK to stay, and there's similar problems in Northern Ireland. I mean, let's not forget, the Northern Ireland peace process has been the predicate for that has been European integration. It's been the fact that the UK and Ireland are both in the same supranational political entity, and that meant that the differences, that the fact that Northern Ireland wasn't a part of Ireland was less significant. Now, if the UK leaves the European Union, you're going to have all these people in Northern Ireland who are no longer part of the EU. And so there's an Irish journalist who said that the Brits voting for Brexit put a bomb under the Northern Ireland peace agreement, because you might need to put up a hard border now between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and there's been an open border there ever since the Good Friday Agreement. So, are we going to see a resumption of the IRA coming back? I don't know, but I'd say the chances are greater now that this is a prospect. I think the chances of Scotland leaving the UK are certainly greater, and I think, from an American perspective, it's not good that the UK is not going to have a voice within the EU. I think they're the closest to us politically, economically, culturally. I think it's been good from our perspective to have them at the table. I think a lot of the more northern European countries, the low countries like the Dutch, they have a similar kind of economically liberal, and by that I mean in the European sense, they have a more free market attitude, and they've appreciated the Brits because they would agree on many of the kind of issues that would come up within the EU. The pressure for them to leave will increase. And the Brits have also been some of the strongest supporters of the eastward expansion of the European Union. And so, as someone who cares about that part of the world, it's unfortunate to see that they're going to be leaving. So I'm pessimistic about it.
The book is The End of Europe. The author is James Kirchick. James, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.